In the archives of the Providence Historical Society lies a long-forgotten photograph taken in March 1904. It captures the wealthy Underwood family in the parlor of their Federal Hill mansion, Jonathan Underwood, his wife Beatrice, and their newly hired domestic servant. At first glance, the photo seems ordinary, but closer inspection reveals a disturbing detail. The servant's right hand resting on the back of Mrs. Underwood's chair bears distinct scars across the knuckles and palm. What no one realized in 1920 was that those same scars had been mentioned in 16 separate police reports over nearly 20 years, each describing the final person seen with the wives of prominent men just before those women died in a string of mysterious domestic accidents. This single photograph, tucked away in a file from an old insurance fraud case, would eventually expose one of America's most meticulous and long undetected serial killers. Before we dive deeper into the chilling case of Elizabeth Hayes and the tragedies that plagued Providence's elite, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more dark historical mysteries. And let us know in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from fellow mystery lovers across the country. In the spring of 1904, Providence was New England's second-largest city, thriving on textile mills, jewelry production, and shipping. Neighborhoods like Federal Hill and Benefit Street were lined with lavish Victorian mansions whose spires and wrought iron balconies symbolized the wealth pouring in from Rhode Island's booming industries. Gas lamps flickered along cobblestone streets, shared by carriages and the occasional motor car, while the air carried a pungent mix of coal smoke and salty breeze from Narragansett Bay. The Underwoods were the epitome of this new aristocracy. Jonathan, 43, had built his fortune manufacturing precision instruments for the railroad industry, employing over 60 men at his South Main Street workshop. His wife, Beatrice, 38, descended from old New England stock, her father a former whaling captain turned investor. Their towering three-story mansion, built in 1887, was an architectural gem that required constant upkeep, hauling coal to the basement furnace, tending gas fixtures, and maintaining the intricate decor. Like many families of their class, they employed multiple servants. But in 1904, reliable help was hard to find. Younger Irish and Italian immigrants were abandoning domestic work for factory jobs drawn by higher pay and more independence. Desperate to fill the gap, Beatrice placed an ad in the Providence Journal on March 15th. Wanted experienced housekeeper for prominent Federal Hill family. Must be of good character with references. Generous wages for suitable candidate. The response she received seemed perfect, though not for the reasons she hoped. Elizabeth Hayes arrived on a gray March morning carrying a modest leather satchel and dressed in simple black, a sign of respectability and perhaps mourning. She appeared to be in her early 40s, her graying hair pulled tightly back and her pale blue eyes sharply observant. Her references on elegant stationery from respected families in Boston and Hartford praised her discretion, her expertise in managing large homes, and her unusual gift for caring for delicate women, suffering from the nervous conditions so common among the upper classes. What impressed Beatrice most, however, was Elizabeth's instinctive grasp of the complexities of Victorian domestic life. She understood how to operate gas fixtures, safely manage coal-burning stoves without smoke, and clean the fragile china and crystal in the parlor with practiced care. In a quiet, measured voice, Elizabeth explained the scars on her hands as the result of old kitchen accidents, her movements calm and deliberate as she assessed the household's needs. "I understand what it means to be overwhelmed by social obligations," she told Beatrice in her soft Irish accent. "Many of my former employers suffered from headaches and nervous exhaustion. I've learned to make remedies that ease those conditions." Her tone was warm, almost maternal, and within minutes, Beatrice felt completely at ease. She had found someone who seemed to truly understand her burdens. To mark what he considered a successful hire, Jonathan Underwood used his new Kodak camera to capture the moment. The three of them arranged themselves in the parlor. Jonathan stood with a hand resting proudly on his wife's shoulder. Beatrice sat with her hands delicately folded in her lap. And Elizabeth stood behind her scarred hand, placed gently on the back of the chair, in a pose that felt both reassuring and strangely possessive. Neither Jonathan nor Beatrice noticed how Elizabeth's eyes lingered on the sparkle of Beatrice's jewelry during the long exposure. The diamond earrings, the sapphire brooch, the antique gold bracelet. They couldn't have guessed that she was already assessing their worth, or that the woman they had so eagerly welcomed was planning their downfall. Spring in Providence brought fresh air and new blossoms. But inside the Underwood mansion, a much darker transformation had begun. Elizabeth Hayes embraced her role with quiet precision. She rose before dawn to tend the coal furnace, prepared each meal with fastidious care, and kept the house immaculate. Jonathan and Beatrice were soon singing her praises, convinced they'd finally found the perfect servant. But Elizabeth's most important work took place at night, when the house slept. She moved like a ghost, studying the hidden workings of the Victorian home. The gas lines snaking through the walls, the newly added electrical system running alongside them, the iron ducts that carried heat to the bedrooms above. Few understood these mechanical systems, but Elizabeth studied them like a blueprint. She learned how to create subtle faults, imperceptible leaks, and harmless-looking malfunctions that could later be deadly. Within her first month, she had won the couple's trust entirely. She knew exactly how Jonathan liked his coffee. She anticipated Beatrice's requests before they were spoken. More notably, she seemed genuinely concerned for her employer's well-being, often remarking on how tired Beatrice appeared. "Miss Underwood works too hard," Elizabeth would gently tell Jonathan. "This household, the endless guests, no wonder she's so exhausted. She needs rest." Her concern sounded so sincere that Jonathan began paring down their social calendar, believing he was acting in his wife's best interest. Elizabeth soon began handling calls and visitors, explaining that Mrs. Underwood was unwell, that the doctor had advised complete rest. Bit by bit, Beatrice's world shrank. Her once lively afternoons of calls and music became long, silent hours spent alone with Elizabeth. And as the isolation grew, so did Beatrice's dependence on her. Elizabeth seemed to know her moods before she did, always ready with a calming word or gentle suggestion. By late May, Beatrice confided that her sleep had turned restless. She described vivid dreams of suffocating, of falling, of waking in cold sweats with the certainty that someone had been in her room. Elizabeth listened carefully, suggesting the gas lamp might be to blame. "These old fixtures are unpredictable," she explained, adjusting the valve with confident fingers. "If the flame doesn't burn properly, the fumes can bring on the most dreadful dreams." What Beatrice didn't realize was that Elizabeth's skilled hands had created a tiny leak, one that released just enough gas to confuse the mind and weaken the body over time. The first major incident occurred on the evening of May 29th. Jonathan had a business dinner downtown, leaving Beatrice in Elizabeth's care. At Elizabeth's suggestion, they dined informally in the breakfast room, where the atmosphere would be more relaxing. The meal was simple and elegant: herbed chicken, garden vegetables, and a bottle of red wine selected, Elizabeth said, for its calming effects. Over dinner, Elizabeth shared stories of her former employers, especially one Mrs. Victoria Livingston, a refined woman worn down by society's demands. She used to say she felt trapped by expectations, Elizabeth recalled with a sad smile. Poor thing. She only found peace in the end. Beatrice, moved by the tale, confessed her own struggles. How exhausting it was to maintain appearances, how she feared she was losing control over her own life. Elizabeth listened intently, reaching out now and then to rest her scarred hand gently on Beatrice's. After dinner, sensing her employer's fatigue, Elizabeth offered to help her retire early. She brushed Beatrice's hair with long, soothing strokes, ensured the bedroom was comfortable, and made a final adjustment to the gas lamp. The flame flickered steadily, casting gentle shadows across the room as Elizabeth kissed her forehead, an oddly intimate gesture, and withdrew to the servants' quarters. In the silence that followed, the Underwood house exhaled softly, its gas lines humming just beneath the surface, and its darkest secrets waiting to unfold. What transpired in the early hours of May 30th, 1904, would haunt Providence investigators for years, though the truth wouldn't come to light until over a decade later. Beatrice Underwood was discovered lifeless at the foot of the grand staircase, her neck broken, her silk nightgown soaked in blood, and her grandmother's gold bracelet still on her wrist. But her diamond earrings and sapphire brooch items she always kept in her bedroom were missing. Elizabeth Hayes, the first to find the body, let out a scream that summoned nearby neighbors. Her sobs sounded raw and grief-stricken as she cradled Beatrice's head, lamenting that she should have heard something, should have been able to prevent the tragedy. When Jonathan Underwood was finally reached by telegram and returned from his business engagement, he found Elizabeth still at his wife's side. Her dress stained with blood and her face streaked with tears. To all present, it looked like an unfortunate accident, tragic but not uncommon. Detective Captain William Brennan of the Providence Police arrived later that morning. A seasoned officer and the son of Irish immigrants, Brennan had seen his share of household mishaps in these sprawling Victorian homes. He quickly identified what appeared to be a classic case of a misstep on the polished staircase, a fall from the top landing likely while Beatrice was on her way to the water closet or responding to a noise. The ornate runner on the stairs was known to shift, and the marble floor below left little room for error. Her injuries matched the scenario, a clean, devastating break to the neck. Elizabeth's account of the evening was clear and consistent. She had helped Beatrice to bed shortly after 10 and then retired to her quarters in the servants' wing. She claimed to have slept soundly until rising at 5:30 a.m. to begin breakfast preparations. When she noticed that Beatrice hadn't come down for her usual tea, she went upstairs, found the bedroom empty, and then saw the body at the base of the stairs. To Jonathan, the story made painful sense. The missing jewelry likely misplaced. In his grief, he couldn't recall what had been in the box the night before. Maybe the pieces were out for cleaning. Maybe they had been moved during the chaos. He didn't question it. Neither did Captain Brennan, though one detail did catch his attention: Elizabeth's right hand. The scars visible when she gestured during her statement were notable. She explained them as the result of a burn from an old stove during her time with a Hartford family. Brennan made a note, but saw no reason to doubt her. After all, such injuries were common among long-time domestic workers. In the weeks following the funeral, Elizabeth became indispensable to Jonathan. She managed the household, responded to condolences, arranged deliveries, and kept the home running with quiet efficiency. Her presence seemed to anchor the grieving widower through his darkest hours. But by late summer, Jonathan found himself emotionally drained and increasingly repelled by the mansion that now felt more like a mausoleum. He began to consider selling the estate and moving into a smaller apartment closer to his business. When he confided this to Elizabeth, she took the news with poise and understanding. She expressed concern for his well-being, offered her thanks for the opportunity, and prepared to move on. On September 15, 1904, she departed with the same small satchel she had arrived with months earlier. Jonathan provided her with generous severance and a glowing reference, wishing her the best as she mentioned plans to find work in Hartford. He believed their paths had crossed for a reason and now gracefully diverged. But Elizabeth Hayes was not vanishing. She was repositioning. Less than 2 years later, she quietly returned to Rhode Island. Not to Federal Hill, where she might be recognized, but to the newly developing suburbs, where fresh wealth was blooming. Providence was expanding, and industrial fortunes were being made by men who built factories and shipping companies almost overnight. Their wives, often from humbler origins, were thrust into lives of etiquette, elaborate homes, and social climbing they were ill prepared for. They became the perfect prey. Between 1906 and 1918, Providence experienced a troubling series of fatal accidents in upper-class homes. In nearly every case, the wife of a wealthy businessman died under suspiciously domestic circumstances. Falls downstairs, gas leaks, carbon monoxide poisoning from coal furnaces. The pattern was consistent. The husbands were away on business. The victims were discovered by recently hired housekeepers or companions. And in the days that followed, small valuables, brooches, rings, heirlooms, would quietly disappear, blamed on confusion or misplaced grief. No connection was made at the time. The city chalked it up to the dangers of modern living in a world of unstable heating systems and complicated gas lines. But beneath the surface, a far more calculated pattern was unfolding. One that would remain hidden until a single photograph buried in an old insurance case file would unlock the mystery nearly 2 decades later. The similarities between the household deaths Elizabeth Hayes orchestrated over 2 decades remained invisible to investigators focused on isolated incidents, each separated by months, years, and jurisdictions. Without a centralized investigative body or forensic consistency, the pattern passed unnoticed until tragedy and financial scrutiny finally intersected in 1920. It wasn't the police who uncovered the truth, but an insurance investigator tasked with reviewing questionable claims tied to a series of accidental deaths. What he uncovered would unravel a deadly legacy nearly 2 decades in the making. But in 1904, that reckoning was still far off. As Elizabeth Hayes, now calling herself Catherine Lynch, moved undetected through the gilded households of New England, she refined her methods with clinical precision. The photograph taken in the Underwood parlor, capturing her scarred hand, resting on Beatrice's chair, sat forgotten in a police file, its significance unrecognized. Those scars embedded in silver nitrate held answers no one had yet learned to ask. The years following Beatrice Underwood's death brought sweeping change to Providence. The industrial boom of the early 20th century created new fortunes and a rising class of newly rich families. Men who built wealth through rubber shipping precision, manufacturing, and railroad logistics. These men often married women from modest backgrounds, women thrust into lives of social decorum, estate management, and relentless pressure. These women, unprepared and overwhelmed, were exactly the kind of targets Elizabeth sought. She briefly resurfaced in Hartford before returning to Rhode Island in 1906, reinvented once again. She adjusted her appearance, subtly changing hairstyles, tweaking her clothing to suit her employer's expectations, and even modulating her accent to sound more Irish or more English, depending on preference. Her forged references spoke of discretion, experience, and a talent for managing delicate, anxious mistresses. In this way, she gained entry to her next household and her next victim. Margaret Tillinghast, wife of textile magnate David Tillinghast, lived in a sprawling Gothic revival mansion in the Elmwood neighborhood. 20 years younger than her husband and socially overwhelmed, Margaret welcomed Elizabeth's arrival with relief. The routine played out almost identically to what had unfolded at the Underwood home. Elizabeth encouraged Margaret to rest more, to cancel gatherings, to lean on her as a confidant. She prepared custom meals, brewed soothing tonics, and slowly pulled Margaret away from her support system. By night, Elizabeth studied the house's elaborate gas and steam systems, learning every valve fixture and weakness. On December 12, 1906, Margaret was found dead in her bed, the room filled with gas from a chandelier that had apparently malfunctioned. Elizabeth, ever the loyal servant, opened windows and summoned help, but too late. Margaret was gone. Captain William Brennan, now head of Providence's detective division, conducted the investigation. Though thorough, he found no obvious crime. Faulty gas fixtures were a known hazard, especially in winter when closed windows stifled ventilation. Elizabeth explained that she had noticed the chandelier's odd behavior the day before and intended to call for a repair. It seemed tragically plausible, but something about her seemed oddly familiar. As she gestured during her statement, Brennan noted the scars on her hand. They tugged at a memory, though he couldn't immediately place it. When he mentioned this, Elizabeth volunteered that she had once worked for the Underwood family and had given a statement after Mrs. Underwood's fall. That was it, Brennan remembered her now. But in the absence of solid evidence, the coincidence didn't raise alarms. The missing jewelry from Margaret's bedroom was chalked up to confusion. Elizabeth said Margaret had sent pieces out for cleaning. In the emotional aftermath, no one could say otherwise. David Tillinghast, racked with guilt for his frequent absences, never questioned it. Elizabeth stayed with the family through the winter, overseeing the closing of the mansion after David decided to relocate. As before, she left quietly and respectfully, armed with another glowing letter of recommendation. Between 1907 and 1918, Elizabeth Hayes, under various aliases and slight physical alterations, would leave a trail of 13 more bodies across Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Her victims varied, but her methodical approach did not. She adapted her techniques to each household, avoiding any clear pattern. Some women died in apparent accidents, gas leaks, faulty wiring. Others succumbed to what seemed like sudden illnesses, later speculated to be the result of slow-acting poisons that mimicked heart failure or neurological decline. Her success stemmed from a perfect storm of conditions. As a live-in servant, she had uninterrupted access to the inner workings of her victims' lives and homes. She understood how to manipulate complex household systems, gas, heat, electricity, with the precision of a trained engineer. And she knew how to position herself as indispensable, nurturing trust, even as she undermined the very people she was hired to protect. More critically, she exploited the era's fragmented and underdeveloped forensic practices. Police rarely communicated across jurisdictions. Domestic deaths were rarely investigated with rigor, especially when mechanical failure or illness could plausibly be blamed. Each tragedy was seen in isolation until at last someone began to see the connections. The truth waiting silently in case files, death records, and one photograph tucked away in a dusty box would not emerge until 1920. But when it did, the story of Elizabeth Hayes would shock the Northeast and force investigators to finally reckon with the reality that America had unknowingly harbored one of its most elusive serial killers. Second only to her technical precision, Elizabeth Hayes' success rested on a shrewd understanding of her social invisibility. She deliberately selected victims already battling anxiety, depression, or chronic illness, women for whom sudden decline or tragic accident would seem tragically plausible. She moved frequently across state lines, cycling through identities and keeping any one police department from seeing a pattern. And above all, she exploited the status of domestic servants in early 20th century society, valued for their labor but largely ignored as individuals. Police rarely considered that a grieving housekeeper might have orchestrated a death, especially when that housekeeper wept at the scene, provided orderly, helpful testimony, and bore no visible motive. But in 16 separate cases over 14 years, police reports had mentioned the same feature scars on the right hand. Those hands, silent and scarred, were the only consistent physical evidence linking the deaths. Without a centralized database or interstate cooperation, no investigator saw the pattern. Each death was filed away as another household tragedy. And Elizabeth, ever more confident, continued her work unchecked. By 1918, Elizabeth had turned her craft into near-invisible art. But in Newport, Rhode Island, The death of Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald would mark the beginning of her unraveling. Posing as Mary Sullivan, Elizabeth had been with the Fitzgerald household for just 6 weeks when her employer died in a fall down the servants' stairs. As always, Elizabeth appeared devastated. She had summoned help immediately, offered a tearful and coherent account of the events, and remained at her employer's side until the doctor arrived. What Elizabeth didn't anticipate was that Eleanor's nephew, Thomas Brennan Jr., would take a keen interest in the case. A recent Harvard Law graduate with a passion for forensic science, Thomas had grown up listening to stories from his father, Detective Captain William Brennan, about the mysterious string of fatal household accidents that had shadowed Rhode Island's upper class for years. This death felt different to Thomas, not only personal, but suspicious. He began by carefully inspecting the alleged scene of the accident. The stairs were newly carpeted, the banister intact. His aunt was in excellent health for her age and had no history of dizziness or imbalance. The supposed noise from the kitchen that had lured her downstairs left no trace. No broken dishes, no sign of an intruder, no logical explanation for the disturbance that Mary Sullivan claimed had drawn her employer to her death. What truly raised Thomas's suspicion was the missing jewelry. His aunt's diamond necklace, emerald earrings, and a treasured antique bracelet were gone. Mary claimed Mrs. Fitzgerald had hidden them out of fear after hearing about recent burglaries in Newport. But Thomas knew his aunt. She hadn't expressed concern. She hadn't mentioned a single thing about theft. Driven by unease, Thomas began researching similar cases. Using legal archives, local records, and newspaper clippings, he discovered a chilling pattern: 16 deaths, all wives of prominent businessmen. All accidents. All occurring after the arrival of a new housekeeper, always a woman in her 40s or 50s with excellent references and a devastating show of grief. The common denominator. Each victim had been discovered by her servant. The breakthrough came when Thomas visited his father's office in Providence. Together, father and son combed through old files. William Brennan, meticulous by nature, had kept extensive records, even on closed cases. And as Thomas laid out each report, a clear thread emerged. "Look at this, father," Thomas said, spreading the documents across the desk. March 1904. Beatrice Underwood, you noted the housekeeper had scars on her right hand. December 1906. Margaret Tillinghast, the same description. Again in 1909, and again in 1912. Different names. Same hand, same scars. Captain Brennan examined the files, stunned. The cases had once felt separate, incidental. But the same details kept surfacing: age, mannerisms, vague references, and above all, those scarred hands. "The names change," he muttered. "Hair color shifts. But the hand, always the same." He paused, then added slowly, "Thomas, she was in my office 3 months ago." The memory hit him like a cold wind. He had spoken with Mary Sullivan during the Fitzgerald investigation. He had watched her grieve. He had seen the scars, and he had missed the truth staring back at him. Now faced with the staggering possibility that this woman, this actor, had murdered 16 women across 4 states, the Brennans needed proof. No fingerprints, no DNA. They would have to prove that Mary Sullivan, Catherine Lynch, Elizabeth Hayes, all were the same person. Then Thomas remembered something from the Underwood file, a photograph. He raced to the archives beneath the Providence Police Department, with his father by his side, descending into a world of dust and dim lights, of long-forgotten case files and brittle evidence boxes. On a gray February morning in 1920, they found the box marked "Accidental Deaths." Closed cases. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed paper, lay the Underwood file from 1904. And with it the photograph Jonathan Underwood had taken that spring afternoon. The photo was faded, but intact. It showed Jonathan standing beside Beatrice, and just behind them, Elizabeth Hayes, her pale eyes calm, her scarred right hand resting on the back of the chair. The scars were visible. The face, slightly aged now, was unmistakable to William Brennan. "It's her," he said softly. "The same woman I saw as Mary Sullivan." With this photograph, the case cracked open. For the first time, police had a visual link tying the deaths together. Over the next weeks, with careful coordination, the Brennans began matching testimonies, handwriting samples, and witness descriptions across 4 states. And slowly, piece by piece, they assembled the case against one of America's most prolific and most overlooked serial killers. Elizabeth Hayes had thrived in the shadows of wealth and privilege. But the silent language of her scarred hands and the photograph that captured them would ultimately lead to her downfall. Jonathan Underwood stood beside his wife's chair, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder while Beatrice sat gracefully, hands folded in her lap. Behind them, Elizabeth Hayes posed with poise and subtle authority, her scarred right hand placed deliberately on the back of Beatrice's chair. That moment, captured in a single faded photograph from March 1904, became the cornerstone of a case that had eluded justice for nearly 2 decades. As Thomas Brennan scrutinized the image through a magnifying glass, he examined every nuance of Elizabeth's appearance, her posture, the angles of her face, the familiar tilt of her head. Though time had passed, he was certain the woman in the Underwood photograph and the grieving housekeeper known as Mary Sullivan from the Fitzgerald case were the same. But certainty wasn't enough. A legal case against a woman who had changed names, cities, and lives as easily as her hairstyle would require irrefutable documentation links tying her to each of the suspicious deaths she'd left in her wake. Captain William Brennan, now fully committed, began the arduous task of requesting case files from departments in Hartford, Boston, Newport, and other cities where similar accidents had occurred. In 1920, police coordination was slow, dependent on letters, formal correspondences, and the goodwill of overworked departments with inconsistent archives. Many files were incomplete or lost, but Brennan's reputation helped open doors. He leaned on professional relationships and pressed for every shred of evidence. Slowly, the pieces began to arrive. Meanwhile, Thomas took on a different mission, locating Elizabeth Hayes' current whereabouts. Knowing she would likely have sought a new position after the Fitzgerald case, he reached out to domestic staffing agencies across New England. He gave a careful description: an experienced woman in her 40s, Irish background or English references, a soft accent, refined manner, and a scarred right hand. For weeks, there was nothing. Then in May 1920 came a lead from Hartford. An agency reported placing a woman named Helen Murphy with a wealthy family in Stamford, Connecticut, just 2 months after Mrs. Fitzgerald's death. The woman's description matched Elizabeth Hayes exactly, including the scars on her right hand, which she had again explained as the result of a kitchen accident from years earlier. Alarmed by the discovery, Captain Brennan contacted the Stamford Police Department immediately. He requested that they place Helen Murphy under discreet surveillance, while Providence finalized formal charges. Any premature move might alert Elizabeth and give her a chance to disappear once again. Over the following weeks, Stamford detectives monitored the household, where Elizabeth now worked, serving Mrs. Dorothy Whitman. What they uncovered echoed a terrifying pattern. Elizabeth had already begun isolating her employer, discouraging visitors, rescheduling social events, and claiming they were too exhausting for Mrs. Whitman's health. She had also taken over meal preparation and assumed control of her employer's medications, citing concern for her nervous condition. What disturbed the detectives most was Elizabeth's repeated visits to the basement, where she spent hours alone examining the house's heating and gas systems. It was a chilling echo of the Underwood, Tillinghast, and Fitzgerald cases and suggested she was preparing for another accident. The decision to act came on June 15, 1920. Early that morning, Stamford detectives observed Elizabeth tampering with the gas fixtures in Mrs. Whitman's bedroom. The timing, the method, the circumstances, everything pointed toward another imminent fatality. With the pieces now aligned, Captain Brennan traveled to Stamford with a team of officers and an arrest warrant. They waited for her to leave the house for errands, not wanting to risk confrontation inside the residence or place Mrs. Whitman in danger. On a bright June morning, Elizabeth Hayes, known then as Helen Murphy, stepped out of the Whitman home carrying a shopping basket heading toward the city market. She didn't know her shadowed past had finally caught up to her. As she turned the corner near the main street, officers moved in. Calm and composed, even in the moment of arrest, she didn't resist. When asked her name, she gave it as Helen Murphy. But the scars on her right hand told a far older story. She had lived beneath suspicion for 16 years, crossing state lines, manipulating the wealthy, and claiming the lives of women who trusted her. But at last, with a photograph, a scar, and the determination of 2 generations of investigators, Elizabeth Hayes's reign of quiet terror came to an end. Elizabeth Hayes was walking down a quiet tree-lined street in Stamford, Connecticut, her market basket swinging gently at her side when Captain William Brennan approached from behind. He identified himself as a police officer, expecting confusion or denial. Instead, Elizabeth responded with a calm that was chilling. She set the basket down with deliberate grace and extended her hands, the familiar scars on her right palm catching the morning light. "I suppose you finally figured it out," she said quietly. "I wondered how long it would take." There was no outburst, no denial, only the quiet resignation of someone who had long anticipated this moment. Her hand trembled slightly as the cuffs clicked into place, but her composure never faltered. During the train ride back to Providence, she stared out the window in silence, watching the New England countryside roll by, a landscape that had unknowingly played host to her years of calculated killings. When Captain Brennan finally asked the question that had haunted so many for so long, why, she turned to him with eyes as cold and pale as frost. "You wouldn't understand," she said. "Those women had everything. Beautiful homes, husbands who adored them, security, respect. And all they did was complain." Her voice held no remorse, only bitter contempt. When Brennan pressed further, asking if it had all been for the jewelry, she gave a thin, joyless smile. "The jewelry was proof," she said. "Proof I had taken something from them they cherished. Money was useful, but it was never the point. The point was that I could end their ungrateful lives and walk away with their most treasured things." Her trial began on October 3, 1920 at Providence Superior Court and quickly became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in New England history. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious spectators, and grieving relatives. The prosecution, led by the Attorney General with assistance from Thomas Brennan, presented a meticulous and damning case. They laid out Elizabeth's trail of death, 16 women across 4 states. Each with eerily similar circumstances, each discovered by a seemingly devoted housekeeper, bearing scars on her right hand. The photograph taken at the Underwood Mansion in 1904 became a centerpiece of the trial. It clearly showed Elizabeth Hayes, then under her real name, standing behind Beatrice Underwood, with her unmistakable scarred hand resting on the chair. Subsequent photographs from other police files, along with consistent witness descriptions, reinforced her identity and established a timeline stretching back nearly 2 decades. Together they formed a chilling chain of evidence no defense could easily break. Elizabeth's attorney argued that the case was purely circumstantial. He pointed to the inherent dangers of early 20th century homes: gas leaks, faulty wiring, unsteady staircases, as well as the tragic coincidence of his client's repeated exposure to such incidents. But the prosecution had more than accidents and photographs. They had Thomas Brennan's painstaking records tracing Elizabeth's movements under various aliases from city to city, household to household. In each case, she had targeted anxious, often isolated women, whose husbands were frequently away. Jewelry consistently vanished. Medical complaints increased after her arrival. Mechanical systems mysteriously failed. The turning point came with the testimony of Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, the woman Elizabeth had nearly killed before her arrest. Mrs. Whitman recounted how Elizabeth had gained her trust, discouraged her from attending social gatherings, taken over her meals and medications, and gradually eroded her sense of independence. She made me feel as though I was losing my mind. Mrs. Whitman testified to a courtroom gripped with silence. She was kind, thoughtful, even loving. But I was becoming weaker, more confused. If the police hadn't stepped in, I wouldn't be here today. Other former employers, women who had dismissed Elizabeth before her work was complete, added to the portrait of a predator cloaked in domestic perfection. They described her uncanny ability to read her mistress's moods, to comfort them while quietly isolating them, and to gain control over every aspect of their household. The prosecution concluded with expert testimony from Dr. Edmund Morrison, a psychiatrist from Boston. He described Elizabeth as a brilliant but deeply disturbed woman who had constructed a complex psychological justification for her crimes. In her mind, Dr. Morrison explained these murders weren't just about theft or control. They were acts of vengeance against a world that had excluded her. She believed she was delivering justice, Morrison said. Taking down women she viewed as weak, spoiled, and undeserving of the lives they were handed. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. The verdict, guilty on multiple counts of murder. The sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Elizabeth Hayes, also known as Catherine Lynch. Mary Sullivan and Helen Murphy was transferred to the Rhode Island State Prison, where she would spend the rest of her life. She never expressed remorse, never appealed, and never spoke again of the 16 women whose lives she ended, women whose only crime in her eyes had been having what she could not. Dr. Edmund Morrison delivered the chilling insight that would define the trial's psychological arc. The defendant appears to have constructed an entire worldview in which her victims deserved their fate, he told the jury. Elizabeth Hayes believed that the women she murdered were ungrateful for their blessings, comfort, security, and social status bestowed upon them by marriage. By ending their lives and taking their jewelry, she believed she was not just enriching herself, but delivering punishment for what she saw as their indifference and privilege. Elizabeth herself remained a cold, detached presence throughout the trial. She rarely spoke. She showed no emotional response to testimony recounting the fear, isolation, and decline of her victims. She listened impassively to descriptions of how women had slowly lost their strength, their clarity, and ultimately their lives under her care. Sometimes she took notes. Most of the time she simply observed. The once gentle expression that had won the trust of so many now gave way to eyes cold and unreadable, scanning the courtroom like a strategist rather than a penitent. Only once did emotion break through her mask, when the prosecution displayed the recovered jewelry. Each necklace, bracelet, earring, and brooch was identified as belonging to one of the 16 victims. Laid out on a long table before the jury, the glittering collection told a silent story of greed and calculated violence. As Elizabeth looked upon the pieces, her trophies, a faint, satisfied smile crossed her lips. Not remorse, not guilt, but quiet validation, as though seeing proof of her success cataloged and displayed for the world. The trial stretched over 6 weeks. The prosecution's case was relentless, linking Elizabeth to each death with a network of evidence that spanned 4 states and 16 years. There were survivor testimonies, documentation of her multiple identities, timelines of employment, followed by sudden fatalities, and forensic reports indicating tampered gas lines and falsified remedies. The defense could offer only speculative doubt coincidences, possible household hazards, the unpredictable tragedies of turn-of-the-century domestic life. But even those arguments rang hollow. When asked if she wished to take the stand, Elizabeth declined with a silent shake of her head. Her defense team, lacking any credible explanation, appeared resigned. The jury, faced with overwhelming evidence, deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all 16 counts of first-degree murder. Elizabeth Hayes became, in that moment, one of the most prolific serial killers in American legal history. The jury found no ambiguity in the systematic way she had selected, isolated, manipulated, and ultimately executed her crimes. The consistency of her methods, the vulnerability of her victims, and her utter lack of remorse left no space for leniency. When Judge Harrison Blackstone delivered the sentence, he did so with solemn gravity. "You violated the most sacred trust that exists between a household and a servant," he said. "These women welcomed you into their homes, gave you respect, offered you kindness, and placed their safety in your hands. In return, you betrayed them, destroyed them, and took pleasure in their suffering. This court finds no mitigating circumstance to justify clemency." With that, he sentenced Elizabeth Hayes to death by electrocution to be carried out at the Rhode Island State Prison. At last, Elizabeth showed emotion, not fear or regret, but a strange, subdued relief. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the end of a contract. As guards led her from the courtroom, she made no eye contact with the families of her victims. She never looked back. Though the appeals process proceeded as required, it was perfunctory. Elizabeth's attorneys filed the necessary paperwork, but their arguments lacked conviction. The evidence was ironclad, the verdict legally sound, and Elizabeth herself offered no interest in challenging her sentence. She spent her final months writing what she called a memoir, an account of her crimes, motivations, and reflections. But prison authorities, fearing it might glorify her actions or inspire others, confiscated and destroyed the manuscript before it could be smuggled out. On March 15, 1922, 18 years to the day since she had first stepped into the Underwood mansion, Elizabeth Hayes was executed by electric chair. She met her end with the same quiet resolve that had defined her arrest, trial, and incarceration. She expressed no regret. She asked for no last words. She offered no comfort to the families left behind. According to prison records, her final act was to stare at the ceiling of the execution chamber, as if already detaching herself from the world that had denied her what she believed she deserved and which she had punished so mercilessly. Her final words, spoken quietly to the prison chaplain just minutes before her execution, were as bitter as the crimes that had brought her there. They never deserved what they had, anyway. With that, Elizabeth Hayes closed the final chapter of one of the most chilling and complex murder cases in American legal history, a case that would leave a permanent mark on both the criminal justice system and the public consciousness. The case of Elizabeth Hayes became a watershed moment in forensic and investigative history. It exposed deep flaws in how law enforcement agencies handled multi-jurisdictional crimes and highlighted the critical need for better record-keeping and communication between departments. For 16 years, the pattern had been hiding in plain sight, obscured by distance-differing police jurisdictions and the natural assumption that accidents in wealthy homes were just that, accidents. It wasn't until Detective Captain William Brennan and his son Thomas compiled the disparate details from Hartford, Boston, Newport, and Providence that the horrific scope of Elizabeth's crimes came into focus. The photograph taken in the Underwood parlor in 1904, once just a keepsake, became iconic. It now appears in criminal justice textbooks as a powerful reminder that even the most benign piece of evidence can unlock the truth. Captured in silver emulsion, the image of Elizabeth Hayes' scarred right hand, resting behind her first known victim, told a story that no one could have understood at the time. But decades later, it would become the key that exposed a serial killer hiding in plain sight. In the wake of the trial, reforms were swift. Employment agencies instituted more rigorous background checks for domestic workers. Police departments across New England modernized their filing systems and created protocols for sharing information across jurisdictions. Wealthy families, once trusting to a fault, became more cautious when hiring help, demanding verified references and formal interviews rather than relying on reputation or charm. For the 16 families left behind, justice provided only a sliver of consolation. Their wives, mothers, and daughters had not died from tragic misfortune, but from cold-blooded murder by someone they had welcomed into their homes. The realization that the killer had not only lived among them, but thrived on their trust and compassion, made the grief even more unbearable for many. Elizabeth Hayes's case also exposed deeper, more unsettling truths about the world in which she operated. Her victims were isolated by privilege, surrounded by opulence, but often lonely, overburdened by expectations, and emotionally dependent on the very people hired to serve them. Domestic servants in turn moved through these homes like ghosts, vital but invisible, present but unacknowledged. It was within that social blind spot that Elizabeth did her most devastating work. Perhaps the darkest irony of all was that her crimes were made possible by the kindness of her victims. These women treated her with dignity and respect, confided their private struggles to her, and extended humanity to someone society often ignored. Elizabeth repaid their trust with calculated betrayal. She did not strike from anger. In a moment of passion, she studied them, wore them down, and struck only when she was sure she would not be suspected. This story reminds us that evil can wear the softest expression and speak in the gentlest voice. It can walk quietly, keep perfect household records, and weep when the doctor arrives. But behind the facade, something colder, more deliberate may be at work. The scarred hands in that long-forgotten photograph held a secret for 16 years. And when the truth finally surfaced, it exposed a predator who understood the mechanics of death as intimately as she understood the mechanisms of the homes she infiltrated. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.